Welcome to NEK-TV Rocks. My guests today are Jim Condos, Secretary of State, Vermont, and Deputy Secretary of State, Chris Winters. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Excuse me. Thanks for inviting us.
You're in town anyway for a presentation on transparency, but for those who are not going to be able to be at the presentation, can you tell us a bit about what transparency is and how it relates to local government?
Well, first, I think what this transparency tour is we have two sections to it. One is about the open meeting law and how the open meeting law pertains to local government as well as state government. The second part, the second half, is about public records and how the public records are part of the transparency and open government. And our job is to educate, and that's what we're going across the state. By December 31st, we'll have visited what, 14 or
it's 14.
14 places, and we'll go wherever we're asked to come, and we basically take a walk through the state statutes on both of those topics.
How does that really apply to a town like Newport, for example? When we say have a city council meeting, how do the regulations apply there, and how can citizens be tuned into that?
Well, what we have in the state of Vermont are two sections of the law that actually refer back to the Constitution, and it's Chapter 1, Article 6, that essentially says that elected officers of government are basically servants of the people. They're accountable to the people. Both the open meeting law and the public records law refer back to the Constitution in their policy statements. So I think what it is basically in the area of open meetings, public bodies are what you have to be a public body, and the way a public body is described is whether it's a state agency or any subservient group, such as local town officials, local town governments, planning commissions, development review boards, cemetery commissions, library boards, any of those, including the select boards.
Okay.
And Pam, I would just add that we get calls every single day from across the state about open meetings and about public records, and this was Secretary Condos' idea when he was elected, to hit the road and bring the education out there to people who are asking for it. So whether you're a tiny little town or one of our larger cities, many of these towns are experiencing the same problems, or they have the same questions about when does the open meeting law apply? What are my obligations as a public official, and what are my rights as a citizen in holding my government accountable?
What are my rights as a citizen to ask for information? And as you know, Newport has had its challenges in the past, which is why we have a very large hole in the ground here. So we're all a little suspicious, and we're really interested in disclosure. But how do we know what to ask for in disclosure? What can be disclosed?
Well, first, I mean, in the area of public records, excuse me, in the area of public records, all records that are created or acquired by the local government are considered public records.
Okay.
And some of those public records have disclosure requirements or exemptions that prevent some portion of that from being disclosed to the public. So there are 260 plus exemptions scattered throughout the statutes, and they're usually about something very specific.
Like
I was just going to get to that. Social security numbers,
Yeah.
medical information, driver's license, personal information.
But anything that's not personal.
Well, anything that's not, excuse me, anything that doesn't have an exemption to follow it is considered a public record. And generally, most of the documents that a city council or a select board will receive are usually open records, are usually public records. And really, it's about, our democracy is built on the ability of its citizenry to know what their government is doing. We call it the right to know laws, and that's what these laws are about, a right to know.
Do we have the right to ask clarifying questions during a meeting?
Yes,
So, for example, at one of our city council meetings, if there's a presentation to the council and we in the peanut gallery, the residents of Newport, have questions, we are entitled to ask those?
you are entitled, under whatever rules the board has. So the board is allowed to make reasonable
Okay.
rules. And I'll give you an example. This is what I use often. I used to be the city council chair in South Burlington. We had a $10 million operating budget. We would have 2 people show up at the public hearing for that operating budget of $10 million.
Yeah.
Not very many.
No.
But if we were gonna talk about a new leash law on our bike path system, we'd have 150 people show up.
Sure.
And everybody wanted to speak. There would be 75 for it, 75 against it. We had to make some reasonable rules. For instance, we had a sign-up sheet in the back of the room.
Yeah.
And we said we were gonna go through the sign-up sheet, name by name. And that, each person would have no more than 2 minutes to speak. Those are reasonable rules. And I think there should be, whenever an agenda item is up for discussion, the public at some point should be allowed to speak, should be allowed to ask questions. Generally, a select board will get all the questions, their questions out of the way
Sure.
first, and then they might ask the public if there's any comment or questions.
That certainly seems fair.
Yeah, and I think that many towns will also ask up front: is there any any item that's not on the agenda that someone would want to speak to? So usually you ask for that as probably the second item, I think, on the agenda. You would ask for it there.
We find that some towns do hold comment to the very end.
Right.
And that's not a best practice in our view. The intent of the open meeting law is to allow public scrutiny of what your public officials are doing and allow the public a reasonable opportunity to comment on that. So we think a best practice is, as you go through each item, allow for public comment. Doesn't mean you have to allow the audience to take over the meeting. We understand
Right.
there has to be some reasonable
Absolutely.
rules. But to get that input as you go to help inform your decisions as a town official.
Would that also apply for creating a budget? For example, as our city creates its budget, there should be a space there for public input too.
Well, and I don't know we don't know the ramifications of your charter.
Sure.
Of your town charter, or the city charter. There may be requirements in there, but generally, when you have a city manager form of government, the city manager actually works with his department heads to create a budget
Right.
and then presents it
To the council.
to the council, usually in pieces, department
yeah.
by department. And the public should have a right to speak up on that as that's being presented. I don't know how they do it.
It depends. And it sort of doesn't even really matter the way that it is done. It's what do we as citizens have a right to do, and what can we legitimately question?
The simple answer is the public has a right to know, and the public has a right to participate and ask questions.
Yeah, and it certainly seems important to encourage public participation. And
Makes it a whole lot easier.
right, unless we want to continue with just the same people in positions of power who are all going to age out eventually, as we all are, it's really useful to get people interested and involved early. And it's sometimes challenging, particularly to get younger people
It is.
involved.
It is. That is a struggle I think most governments are trying to address today.
We really have a crisis in the trust in government. You see, it's getting worse every day, it seems,
Yes.
where people don't trust their government anymore. And that's why it's really important to do everything out in the open and encourage participation so that they're not afraid of the unknown. They don't think that deals are being made behind closed doors, and the public doesn't think that their voice isn't being heard or doesn't count in the
Right.
discussion.
Yeah, I mean, that is incredibly important. And presumably that's why you're going from town to town, because I can't imagine that this isn't a fairly onerous task going for, it's a lot of travel.
It's a lot of miles.
A lot of miles.
Well, that's why we usually try to do it. The way we set it up is that we wanted no town,
No town left behind. Yeah.
no town to be more than 1 hour away from at least 2 locations. So if, for instance, we're having one here, we're having one in Stowe, and we'll have one in St. Johnsbury. We'll also have one over in St. Albans. So most of the northern part of the state is within 1 hour of at least 2 of those locations.
So you end up staying the night in the town?
No.
Oh, no? Wow. You go back to Montpelier
We go
each
back to
time.
Montpelier after every event.
It's a lot of miles.
It certainly
We're
is.
sometimes a little bleary-eyed the next day.
I bet. I bet. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned a piece of legislation that came out on Friday, and probably most of us saw a bit about it. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. It was a Supreme Court decision that came out, and it had to. It was dealing with the issue of private emails and whether they are subject to open records or public records request. And the question isn't whether private emails are subject to public records request. It's what is the content in those emails. So if a citizen is trying to find out information and they ask, let's say, a mayor or a member of the select board, did you have, I would like to see any communications on the issue of whatever it is, EB5, that you might have had discussions, whether it be by voicemail, text message, email. When you ask when you ask a question in that way, essentially what you're opening up for is the person should go back and look at their email and determine if they had any emails upon the issue of EB5, because it might have been something within their agency business.
Right.
And that's the key is if you remember what a public record is, the public record is a record that is acquired or created in the course of agency business. Doesn't matter where it is, it's created or acquired in the course of agency business. So if it has to do with the authority of that city council, it's the same reason why we advise, and we'll, tonight at our presentation, we'll make sure that people understand that you can't have discussions, the city council or the select board can't have discussions by email, because they could be violating the open meeting law,
Right.
as well as public record law if that is not disclosed in some way.
Does that apply to things like the Planning Commission and the DRB too?
Yes and no, it depends. With both of those, they have portions of their meetings that could be
Quasi-judicial.
quasi-judicial,
Yeah.
which are exempt.
Right. And one of the issues here, or something that has been discussed, I don't know if it's an issue or not, is that our Planning Commission and the DRB do not have public email addresses. They've only have their own personal email. So in fact, every email, which could be really ugly in the future.
I would really strongly recommend that the town or the city provide them with a public email.
Sounds smart to me. So
It just makes more sense than not.
Right.
I mean, when I was the city council chair in South Burlington for 18 years, if I got an email, if I received an email on my personal email, which we didn't have city email then,
Right.
that was from a constituent and had to do with the business of the city, I would always copy the city manager so that whatever whatever the email string was
Yeah.
got into the city's email
Yeah.
system, so that they had a record of it. That's the point, is that any record that's created or acquired in the course of doing agency business must be preserved according to record retention schedules.
That's one of the things we like to emphasize to folks, is to get used to thinking in this way, that any record that you create as an elected official, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the people. It belongs to the town or it belongs to the state. It's a public record. So it doesn't matter where you keep it, whether you take it out of the file drawer and you bring it home to your house, or whether it's in your personal email. The fact that it's a public record makes it subject to a public record request.
Yeah.
And what the court case did actually was basically reaffirm what was already in statute. There was nothing new in that statute, in that decision. What it also did, though, was it also set out that when looking at someone's personal email, you don't have carte blanche for a person to say, I want to look at your email. What you have to do is tell the person, we want you to look at your own email and determine if you have anything that belongs
So you go
in the
with
public domain.
trust that the person will be honest about what's in
That's the
there.
way the court set it up.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was actually a very good, because don't forget what the case that was before the Supreme Court, a lower court had said that the public email or private email was not subject to private or to public record. And that was what was appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court overturned what happened at the lower court.
It's really useful information.
So it was a good win for democracy, a good win for
About time we got
open government.
something. How do cities decide what it's okay to disclose and what it isn't? Because it's not just that a personnel record clearly should not be disclosed, unless there's a very good reason for it. But how, when you're in the sort of heat of the moment in a meeting, and you have the press or residents saying, I want to know X, Y, or Z.
There are times, excuse me. First, I think it is important and it's incumbent upon municipal governments, upon state governments, and different agencies to look at the usual public record exemptions that they might pertain to them, and just know those laws or have them ready. You do have the ability to research, if something is a public record or not. And I think it's important that you don't have to knee-jerk say, no, you can't have that. You can say, well, I might need to research a little bit more to see if that document is not exempt from public record. So you have that ability, and everything now has to be done in writing. So if you deny access, then you have to submit
Put
that in writing and explain why.
I think going back to something that you said earlier, we need to shift the culture in government, state and local government, to a disclose first mentality, subject to some exemptions,
Right.
and not the let's hide it first and deny first and then let them argue for why they're entitled to the record. As Jim starts every presentation out with, he goes right to the Constitution. It's enshrined in the Constitution that the people have a right to know what their elected officials are up to, and that those folks are accountable to the people. And transparency is the way that one of the tools we use to ensure that accountability.
Yeah. It's certainly really important for citizens, and I've certainly sat in some council meetings when that has gone back and forth, and there's been the discussion about, well, legally we can hold this, but do you stick to the letter of the law or the spirit of the law?
It should be the both.
Right, and presumably there are ways of doing that.
Again, sometimes there are gray areas, but even in this court decision that we saw this last Friday, and a previous court decision now twice, the Supreme Court has said that if an area that is under discussion is gray, the courts will fall to the side of disclosure.
It's great.
So they're saying, if you're not sure, you might as well disclose, because it's probably going to fall that way. And now, if someone were to challenge you and take you to court, you have the potential, whether it's open meeting violation and you take an action that maybe you shouldn't have taken because you didn't follow the process, or a public record that you have withheld. If the person asking for it substantially wins the case in the court, the judge has an obligation to enable you to receive your your court costs, your attorney's
Nice.
fees, which didn't happen before. Before it was a May issue attorney's fees. Now it's mandatory.
That's actually really encouraging, particularly for the press, who often ask for information and get stonewalled. And it's a really expensive proposition sometimes.
It is, and at one time, one of the newspapers had 3 cases before the courts, and his expense for the 3 cases was over $40,000.
Wow. Yeah, that's really encouraging. Did the piece of legislation or the decision that came down have anything else in it that would be useful to us regular
No,
citizens?
I think it just really clarified it was both practical and idealistic. It was practical from the standpoint of it set out a process for you to go search for emails that might be necessary, but it was also idealistic in that it followed the law.
Yeah. Do these rules apply to nonprofits as well as to?
Great question. I'll let you answer
Sure.
that one.
Pass the buck.
Give you the lawyerly question. The lawyerly answer. It depends.
Yeah.
It depends. So for most nonprofits, it would not apply. But sometimes an agency. There's a tie to the state, or there's a tie to the funding for the nonprofit that would say you have to comply with the open meeting law. So it really does depend on the nonprofit. UVM, Vermont Public Television, and just a couple of examples of state related. They're an entity of the state in some ways, so they do have to follow open meeting and public records laws, but a lot of nonprofits wouldn't have to.
So our smaller nonprofits up here, for example, probably wouldn't be held to all of those?
Probably not, although it might be tied somehow to the funding or the charter to require compliance with open meetings and public records.
Yeah.
The question we always get is, well, they're 100% funded by the state or 100% funded by the city or town. Does that mean that they have to follow the law? Not unless there was a string attached to the funding that
Yeah.
came to them.
Yeah, and then organizations that get no funding from either the state or from the city presumably are sort of disengaged from that process.
Not necessarily. Again, you have
It
to look at what
depends.
their charter says
Yeah.
and any ties they have to other organizations.
Yeah.
So it's one of those, as he said, the lawyerly question. It's one of those, we don't know.
Yeah.
It depends.
It's very fact specific.
It's
depending on the
really
nonprofit.
interesting, sort of trying to separate the pieces out,
Very much so.
because we sort of think that, there's yes/no answers to everything, aren't there supposed to be? But clearly there are not.
Yeah. And where there's a lot of gray, we give that advice. When in doubt, give it out.
Disclose, yeah. Maybe we should remember that quote and use it at our city council meetings. When in doubt, we were told. Yeah. What other areas do you cover in the presentation that you'll be doing for the other cities, including ours?
Pretty much those are the 2 areas: open meeting law and the public records access. Under open meeting law, we talked about the timeliness of agendas, website posting of agendas on the website.
Executive sessions.
Executive session, we'll talk about executive. You can't go into executive session for anything. It has to be very specific. There's only a few reasons why. There's no action that can be taken in
That has to
executive.
be public then.
You have to come back
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. When do agendas have to be posted so that the public can
A
see
regular
them?
meeting 48 hours
Mhm.
before, a special meeting 24 hours.
Okay. And supporting documents that go with the agenda?
There's nothing in the statutes that talks specifically about the supporting documents. I would say that they should be available prior to the meeting. What that could mean 5 minutes prior to the meeting.
Oh, that's really useful. Not.
I mean, if they've made it available to the city council and it's not private information, I don't see
Right.
why they can't post it. If it's budget documents or whatever.
Yeah.
There's no reason to withhold those.
So supporting documents, say, that go with the presentation, like a water tower. Or
Correct.
that would be useful if we could get that at the time the agenda's posted. We'd like that.
And again, the law is not very specific about what has to be on an agenda, but we talk
Right.
about best practices. If the spirit of the law is to let the public know what's going on and decide whether they want to show up at the meeting and
Mhm.
perhaps make a comment or listen, then the agenda ought to be specific enough that you know what's going to be discussed at the meeting. It
Yeah.
can't just say executive session, or it shouldn't just say executive session, or it shouldn't just say personnel issue or things like that.
It should be a little more.
specific.
Yeah. And if there's going to be a decision made, there should be a warning when that's coming back, or,
Well, often one of the things that was clarified by the legislature, because one of the first questions on an agenda should be, is there any changes to the agenda? Adds or deletes? And what we don't want to see is city councils or select boards getting into the habit of holding something back that might be controversial, and then showing up at the meeting and saying, oh, tonight's a good night to do this because there's no public, so let's add this to the agenda and we'll take it up.
yeah.
Not that ever happens. We've
No,
never
I'm
heard
sure
that
it
happen.
doesn't.
So what we advise is that if you're going to do something, where you're going to add something to the agenda, it should be for information only, and that you'll warn it for action on the next agenda.
Yeah,
That's the proper way to do it, the best way,
that makes sense.
because the public needs to know.
We think so.
We keep coming back to that. The public has a right to know, the public has a right to participate. As long as you remember those things when
Yeah.
you're in government, you can stay out of trouble.
What is the bottom line of the presentations? What is it you want people to walk away from those meetings getting?
That the real boss, the ultimate boss, is the public, are the citizens. They are the ultimate boss.
Yeah, clearly I'm not from around here.
Really?
Yeah, shocking, I know. One of the things that has sort of amused me is that people talk about elected leaders. My understanding, and having become a citizen, is that we don't elect leaders, we elect representatives. And that's a whole different mindset. It's a different way of looking at who's sitting on that throne. They are representing me and
That's right.
everybody
correct.
else.
And accountable to you.
Yeah,
And I should say, we don't want to leave the impression that there are a bunch of bad local officials out there sneaking around doing things
No, I
the
don't
wrong
think
way.
they are.
There are a lot of really great people who are volunteering their time.
yes,
And it's often a thankless job, and they're doing a very good job, and they want to do the right thing. The purpose of our transparency tour is to educate.
yeah, that's great. And we're about out of time. It goes really fast. Thank you so much for being willing
You're
to
welcome.
come in.
Thanks for having
And I
us.
hope your meeting tonight is packed.
So do I.
Thank you.
We enjoy it better that way.
Yeah. Though I actually enjoyed the last one when there were only a few of us there. Very few.
Thanks for
Thank you.
having us.
Thanks.
Thank you for being willing to do this.